This is things I wish I could say in Sunday school. I want to share some thoughts and ideas that are different than what we usually hear. My goal is to be really honest rather than inherently faith-promoting. I hope these ideas may spark some interesting discussions with your friends, families, or classes. Please enjoy. This is the lesson for May 20th through 26th, Mosiah chapters 18 through 24. Today's topics are Alma's baptism, covenants, and is an organized church necessary? I'm going to start this week by talking a bit about Alma's baptism. I remember a Book of Mormon Institute manual that bent over backwards to explain that Alma had priesthood authority from God to do the baptisms in Mosiah 18. They quoted Joseph Fielding Smith, and I looked up the quote. He said, "In the case of Alma and his priesthood, we are left to surmise that he legally and divinely received it before the days of King Noah. We read that Zeniff, the father of Noah, was a righteous man. Alma evidently received the priesthood in the days of Zeniff, and at no time did he fully accept the teachings, or with full purpose follow the counsels and procedure of Noah and his wicked priests." Now I'm going to read Mosiah chapter 18, verses 14 and 15. "And after Alma had said these words, both Alma and Helam were buried in the water, and they arose and came forth out of the water rejoicing, being filled with the Spirit. And again Alma took another and went forth a second time into the water and baptized him according to the first, only he did not bury himself again in the water." So I guess Joseph Fielding Smith and many others felt compelled to apply modern church structure to ancient cultures and make up stuff so that the ancient stories fit our modern understandings of authority and organization. At this point in my spirituality, it boggles my mind that people felt so insecure in their faith that they made up complex backstories in order for everything to fit. I don't believe it makes any sense to believe that Alma had hands laid on his head and had the priesthood conferred on him like we do in our church, and that he can trace his line of authority back to Lehi or Melchizedek or whatever. I have no issue with Alma feeling moved upon by the Spirit to baptize himself and Helam at the same time, and our heavenly parents being completely okay with it. I think that's the reading of the text that makes the most sense. But the reason why church leaders and apologists contort things and make up backstories is so the church's claim of exclusive authority from God remains intact. If God authorized Alma through the Spirit to baptize and call priests and organize a church, etc., then the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints isn't in complete control of God's authority now. I would just encourage you to ask yourself what explanation makes the most sense to you. Did God authorize Alma to perform baptisms directly? Or did Alma have hands laid on his head by other men who had the same thing prior that was never mentioned at all and apparently wasn't important enough for Mormon to include in his abridgment? Or does any of this even matter? The main message from the lesson manual this week is covenants. I don't know how you feel, but I'm so exhausted from the constant emphasis on covenants in the church for several years. There are so many good, helpful things we could emphasize that are just pushed off to the side so covenants can be center stage. Probably 14 years or so ago, I gave a lesson on covenants in Elders Quorum. I reviewed the scriptures and said for my reading, there are 3 types of covenants in the scriptures. Covenants made through ordinances, covenants made by a group of people, and covenants made by an individual. Some examples of covenants made by a group are King Benjamin's people after his address, and the anti-Nephi-Lehi's covenant against violence. In this lesson in Mosiah 18, Alma's followers do a group covenant coupled with the baptism ordinance. However, I find the covenants made by an individual to be the most compelling. When I gave this lesson many years ago, I wanted people to feel empowered to make their own deals with God. I framed it as letting God know what we really care about and showing our commitment. I tried to express how this is not about controlling outcomes or God. Now, I view these covenants as being even more personal. It's not really about God, it's about the individual, making a covenant about who they will be. The example I always think about is Ruth. The way I read her story is that she makes a covenant about who she will be in regards to her mother-in-law Naomi. I'm going to read Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. And Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. I believe this is a covenant Ruth is making about who she is going to be. She probably feels like this is a covenant to God, but she could also feel like this is a commitment to herself. And my wife pointed out that she probably also feels like this is a commitment to Naomi, and that these women really loved each other. It's a female perspective on this kind of relationship that I would not have seen myself. I don't think there is a distinguishable difference between whether the covenant is between God or a commitment to herself, but I could understand if people felt like they would be more likely to break a commitment to themselves. In that case, framing it as a covenant with God, if that makes it more meaningful to the individual, that's great. I think another example of an individual covenant that isn't spelled out in the scriptures is Peter after denying Christ 3 times. The scriptures say Peter went out and wept bitterly. I see a covenant here where Peter makes a commitment about who he will be going forward. He was a changed person afterwards. The scriptures don't say it outrightly. He may have never communicated it to anyone. It was probably completely private. But I don't think it's a stretch to read between the lines and see that he made a personal covenant after this experience. Now, covenants made through ordinances. These are the only ones that the church really cares about. When the church says covenants, they pretty much mean ordinance-related commitments. I think there is a lot of beauty and goodness that can be derived from these rituals. I have received essentially all of the main ordinances that men receive in the church. But none of the ordinances make me who I am. They don't create a relationship with my heavenly parents. In my opinion, they aren't what really matters in life. Ordinances are not who we are, and they are not really learning to love like Christ. One of the problems that I and many others have with some ordinances in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is that it's impossible to really fully give consent when we receive them. Specifically, baptism at the age of 8 is still, I think, really too young to be able to fully commit to everything that the church says that means. Your brain is still in the early stages of development. It is too young to make that kind of commitment. And I also think that this lack of consent applies to endowments in the temple because people are specifically told that they cannot explain what this is to people before they commit to it. So you go into the temple not knowing what's going to happen, what you're committing to, and you cannot really give consent to it. Yet, these rituals can have personal meanings and often happen at benchmark moments in our lives. The skeptic in me thinks that that's on purpose. These rituals happen at these benchmark moments so that they feel more important and more meaningful to us. I also can't help but see that the ordinances of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints puts the church in between us and God. The church says it has the only legitimate baptism and all the rest of the ordinances. So if we love God, we have to do it through the church. I don't think that's right, but I see the immense emphasis that the church has been putting on covenants. The only covenants I ever really see them reference are ordinances, which the church retains complete control over. It feels like the real goal of the emphasis on covenants is to maintain as much control over the people as the church can. Keep the people dependent on the church. The church must remain central in people's lives because it positions itself between the people and God. I genuinely like covenants, but I don't like the church's current dialogue about them because it's manipulative and it has been incessant for years now. After the people following Alma are baptized, he organized them and calls them a church. A lot of the lesson manual for this week is about how important a church is. I am a person that likes organization. I understand its value. I usually get much more out of a well-organized talk or article than something that is unorganized or more stream of consciousness. But that's not always the case. The message or idea is more important than the organization. Yet organization makes the idea more palatable for many. The manual asks, how would you respond to a friend or family member who doesn't believe that an organized church is necessary? And I immediately think, necessary for what? The lesson talks about how important church is, so Alma organized one. But I also think it's interesting that Lemhi wanted a church and Ammon declined to help organize one. So I'm going to read parts of Mosiah chapter 21, verses 31 through 34. And this is Lemhi's people. They themselves had entered into a covenant with God to serve him and keep his commandments. And now, since the coming of Ammon, King Lemhi had also entered into a covenant with God, and also many of his people, to serve him and keep his commandments. And it came to pass that King Lemhi and many of his people were desirous to be baptized, but there was none in the land that had authority from God, and Ammon declined doing this thing, considering himself an unworthy servant. Therefore they did not at that time form themselves into a church, waiting upon the Spirit of the Lord. I think it's really interesting that there was a desire for an organized church, but they didn't do it. I know most people in the church would say that it's because of a lack of priesthood authority. I think it has more to do with the trauma of these people coming out of being led by an evil organized church by Noah and his priests. If having a church was so supremely necessary, Lemhi would have organized one even though the situation wasn't ideal. The lack of a church didn't nullify the covenants that Lemhi and his people made with God. It's easy to think about how important organized religion is, with Alma organizing it right after baptizing people. But we shouldn't forget how Noah and his priests used their organized religion for evil. Back to the question from the manual. Is an organized church necessary? My answer is no. But a well-organized, righteous church that truly serves the world rather than itself would be a very helpful thing. Churches can do a lot of good, and they have a lot of power. It just depends on what they are doing. If the church is focused on enriching itself and maintaining power like King Noah's, then it's evil. If the church is focused on truly helping people cultivate their own spirituality and helping those in need, then it's good. Problem is that pretty much every church is a mixed bag, and that the nature of power corrupts, and pretty much all churches have a lot of power. That's it for this week. Thanks for listening. Please share with family and friends. Until next time.